Perfect. We're going. So we're gonna. You want to talk about Anthony?
Yeah. You have to remember that the corner of Carolina and Busty Avenue was my uncle or my godfather actually had a big home. The corner was a great big saloon. And there's one feature about that, because there was an apartment in the back where we lived, my mother and the kids. And then there was an
And your mother's name was?
My mother, is married to my father.
And her name?
And Salvatore.
No, her name.
Maria.
So Salvatore Losi is your father, and Maria is your mother.
Yeah, and
Giardina?
Giardina. And Giardina, her mother was a Lafornaro at that time. So while that might be confusing, it shouldn't be, because of my grandmother, or my mother's mother, married a Lafornaro.
Mm-hmm.
And then she married a Joseph Sidoti.
Sidoti.
The Sidoti family comes in and on that point.
Okay.
But they moved a block away from Busty and Carolina. And my godfather, who was my father's older brother, he was the one that brought my dad over.
Yeah.
Through diplomatic resources somehow, that he brought him over when he was 14, according to Janet's research.
Is that right?
And one of the things that is apparent is the big family that Joe was of. In other words, there was Sam, Augie,
Nick.
And then
Charlie.
After Nick came Joe, and after Joe came, what was that?
Albert.
Albert.
Johnny.
And Johnny.
And Johnny.
Rose,
You miss Charlie. And you miss...
Charlie was before.
Yeah.
After Nick.
Yeah, I think Charlie is just older than my father.
Right.
So it's Sam,
Nick,
Charlie, Joe.
You got to
Augie.
remember.
Augie.
Put Augie after my cousin Sam.
Yeah.
Augie comes. He was the oldest, and he was before Nick, from what I get.
Oh wow! So Nick was third in line.
Yeah, third. Yeah.
So it's Sam, Augie.
Yeah, same Augie. Well, anyway, the main thing about that is that we lived in the back of the saloon, and on the other side of, on the top of the saloon was the family of
Anthony.
And on the
Maria.
other side there was an empty flat, and then a shoe store down below.
Did he own the building?
Yes, he owned that building. He was quite, my godfather was quite a man, for the simple reason he was at one time in Italy a policeman with the feather.
Is that right?
And yeah, he was a policeman, and often, from what I gather, they call him a cavaliere.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the gun that it was a carbon gun. Now, since he became my godfather, and his wife became my godmother. The idea of being a godfather is very difficult in how we relate to them. One of the things is that whenever I came in the house, Sam and everybody else at the table moved down, and I took the head of the table.
Mm.
And not only that, my godfather, at one time, I remember him actually handing me a shasku. It was a wine vessel, and you grab it with both hands, and there's on this wine vessel, there's a shape of the lips, and you pour the wine down when you put your mouth on that vessel. The shasku,
Shasku.
as I remember being called. Now, I almost choked to death on it because it was such a big gulp. And my,
Do you remember how old you were then?
I must have been around 8. There was no doubt about it that it was around that time when I remember, because just before that, there was a period when my mother went to Holy Cross to get me Holy Communion. And the Holy Communion, my mother was refused at Holy Cross. So she told Father Gambino to go to hell. And I wouldn't doubt it. And she took me over to St. Anthony's behind the City Hall. Now, at St. Anthony's, then I got Holy Communion there. But I remember the day because my mother bought me a suit or coat. Well, it was one of the, either pants or coat, whatever.
You're 8 years old at this time.
I'm about 8 or maybe even less.
This is 1925.
Around that time, yeah. The thing about that is that my godfather put me on his shoulders. And I remember going down Carolina Street, over to Trenton Avenue, and back and around on his shoulders. And as he stopped at different people that he knew, they came out and pinned dollar bills on me. And I'm going around there delighted at being pinned with money. And I must have had at least $20 or $30 on me.
Mm.
Because he knew many people from the saloon.
Mm.
And my godfather was quite a drinker too. He loved his beer and his cigar. His cigar is one thing that I remember because it smelled so bad. Everybody used to say,
This is really fabulously interesting. So my grandfather Anthony is a cigar smoker.
yeah.
And you know what?
Stogies.
My Uncle Charlie smoked cigars. I can remember him smoking those short cigars.
Short cigars.
And I was like, Uncle Charlie, that, I mean, I never told him this, but it was like, God, those stink.
Yeah. But the thing about, I can tell you a little bit about the stogies that my godfather, see, when I used to go down to Dandy Place in their butcher shop, my father worked there, and I used to go down to Dandy Place
Mm-hmm.
and stay with him. Now, the point about the cigar is that I remember my father told me to stay outside the butcher shop. And
Mhm.
next to the butcher shop there was a small store with a window. There usually was, the window was part of the living room of the people that lived there.
Mm-hmm.
But in here there was 3 women, and they used to roll cigars.
Wow.
And they had a table in front, and I remember watching them roll that cigar. And it just was, it got to be, at least 10 inches or more
Okay.
with the leaf. And then they cut it in half, and then I remember them dipping it in some kind of wine or something in the background. But I remember the woman telling me, you better go back, don't have to watch us, or something like that.
Uh-huh.
But the idea of my godfather actually smoking these small pieces of cigars, or stogies as they called them, it was horrible. There was a smell besides the burnt wine and the burnt tobacco. But the thing about that is that when he took me around the neighborhood and I got pinned back with all the wine, with all the dollar bills, the important thing was that whenever I went to see my godmother, his wife,
Maria.
they often were quarreling.
Mm.
And the biggest quarrel was one time I went there. I used to go there just right after school. And the one thing about my aunt and my godmother was that I called her the Duchess.
The Duchess.
And it really looked up at the Duchess because she was the ruler of all of Busty Avenue from Carolina to the City Hall.
Is that?
She was the one woman that had marriage for all the people that grew up within there that she knew.
She had marriage.
She was a marriage.
She was
Well,
a matchmaker.
Matchmaker. That was the word. And she had control of that whole street and besides. Now, when you look back at it, Sam got married by her, a woman that my Aunt Mary
Mm-hmm.
saved for him when he came back from the army.
My Aunt Mary.
I got that's one that she married. Then
Mm-hmm.
Augie, she married Mary Colombo,
Mm-hmm.
and then she missed up on Nick.
Oh,
The
yeah.
simple thing that Nick says, I want to marry Mary Sites,
Yeah.
Yeah.
an Irish woman.
Mm-hmm.
And when he said that, and he did marry Mary, his father, my godfather, threw him out of the house. He never entered that house anymore.
Is that right?
And
How old was he then?
Nick must have been at least 18 or 19.
Okay.
He was young, but he never married what his mother told him that he should marry.
He broke the rules.
He broke the rule. That's right.
And he got thrown out of the house.
And he got thrown, and he never entered that house anymore.
Is that right?
They spoke to him though. I mean,
Huh?
it wasn't like they never spoke to Nick. He was still within the family.
He was within the family, but he never entered that house. Nick told me that he never. In fact, Nick was the first one to come to the country when my godfather died.
Mm.
We were out in the field, and he collapsed in the bean field where we were picking. And then we took him, my brother Tony and I took him to the shack, and I remember my brother lifting him up and putting him on the bed, and he was dying then.
Oh my.
Or perhaps he was already dead.
Mm.
We weren't too sure. But Nick was the first one to come to the cottage or to the shack, the
Cabin.
the farm
on this
shack.
farm.
On the farm.
Do you
cabin.
remember
On
whose
the
farm?
farm.
Whose farm was that?
I think it was De Pavlo's.
Yeah, I think it was De Pavlo's.
I'm pretty sure.
Do you remember the year?
I must have been. I was an 8th grader or first freshman. That would be 37 or 38, something like that. But
He passed that.
to be exact, I have to look at some of the things.
You
that-
were there.
I was there. I was holding up his legs. My brother Tony was holding up the main part of his body. And my aunt, the Duchess, or my godmother, she was hysterical. But we got him, and Nick was the first one to arrive there. And Nick always saluted my godfather. Saberanika was the word. God bless you. Or will God bless you.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever phrase you want to use with it, that's what was the greeting. In fact, they greeted me like that in Sicily by one of the guides. That's how Sicilians talk to one another before they get really acquainted. And I remember Nick was the first one there and talked to him as if he was alive, but he was dead on the bed. But Nick was the first one. Sam was working, Augie was working somewhere else. But anyway, none of them knew. I don't know how Nick knew. Somehow he found out that he wanted to make contact with
It makes sense.
with my godfather in many ways, and he never. I often thought it was a sad thing for the simple reason, why? That's your son.
Yeah.
Why are you not talking to him?
Yeah.
And that idea of sort of like got into my cousin Sam, because he did the same thing to his son. He never talked to his son. And
You're saying my Uncle Sam never talked
my
to
Uncle Sam.
never talked to his son Anthony.
Yeah.
He closed the door.
He closed the door.
Anthony came one time to me on his own, and he wasn't completely dislocated from his father. They still were going to St. Anthony's together.
Okay.
And one of the things that happened is that at that time, Sam wasn't too sure what he would do. But Tony, his son, came over to me and he says, you know, I heard that you read a lot. And he says, I'm starting to read War and Peace. I says, what good is it reading? But then he says, there's something happening with my father. And I says, well, what, you know, you two people should get together, your father and I found out later that it was maybe a month later that I found out that he threw him out. He actually, my mother is often the one that said that Mary, Sam's wife,
Okay.
had the face of the Madonna, what they call Dolorosa. In other words, the sad Madonna. The sad Madonna is what Mary had on her face from then on. And my mother was very aware of it. She was the only one that actually belonged to a society, Maria Dolorosa. And they knew about how Anthony, the son that actually took off and went to New York,
Mm-hmm.
and Anthony became quite a writer in the New York Times. I found out later, in the New York Times editorial staff. He was part of the editorial staff for the New York Times. Being that he was quite a writer, I lost track of it.
This is the first I ever heard of my cousin Anthony being a writer on the staff of the New York Times.
Oh yes, he was that. He went directly, and I think it was because he knew quite a few people in the society, or in the group that he was going with.
Okay.
See, he had to get away from his dad,
Yeah.
and
You knew that my cousin Anthony was gay.
yeah, in other words, there's two people in the family of the Losis that were gay. Not only was Anthony's Sam's son,
Yeah.
there were also his own brother, Johnny,
Yeah, sure.
the younger one.
Mm-hmm.
He got married. He was married. After married, he didn't realize that
He realized
married
that.
was his forte, so he took off and they went to Cleveland.
Yes.
And Johnny was one of the few people that was very kind to everyone that he knew.
Yeah.
Yeah,
He
he was
was
nice.
perhaps
I remember.
the greatest kindness
Yeah.
in any of the Losis.
Yeah.
He loved everybody, and everybody loved him.
Everybody loved him.
That's right.
I often tell the story that my Uncle Johnny, growing up in a very conservative Roman Catholic Sicilian family,
Right.
somehow, and maybe you can say something more about this, Joe, somehow he's able to come back into the family on visits
Right.
from Cleveland to Buffalo. I'm thinking mid-60s, as early as I can remember.
That's right.
He's gay, he's there with his partner, and everybody loves him. He's
Everybody
totally out
He
in the
was-
family.
He was probably the most lovable man I'd ever met. Grace met him once, and she cared for him a lot. And one of the things that he did, all the women that were married to the Losis, he got in touch with them. I don't know how he did it. It was one of the few things that I remember about Johnny. He was the perfect man for getting along with people. He couldn't do no wrong
Did
with anyone.
did he? What was his relationship like with his father and his mother?
Well, they got to be pretty old before their time. Actually, my godfather and my godmother, I remember one time going up there and opening the door and walking in, and the two of them were quarreling. My godfather and my godmother. They were
Mhm.
quarreling. And as I entered, my godmother dropped her knife. They were quarreling around the table. And I was so scared that I walked out again, because I abruptly, you know, I was always welcome the idea that I could open the door.
Sure.
And I opened the door and they were quarreling. And one of the things I gathered from the little Italian that I understood then was that, "Don't you come near me," my godmother was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And that was after her 9th child.
Mm.
And
No wonder she's because
She's holding a knife.
and she dropped the knife. And she looked at me and says, Latini, get out of here. She told me to get out.
How old are you then?
I would say I'm 12.
Okay.
Later on, when I was going to high school, the last year of grammar school, playing baseball, the thing that I remember most is my godmother paying very much attention to me and very little attention to the boys. The only one that my godmother paid attention to was Rosie, because Rosie took over making the bread and cooking the meals, and actually my
No wonder there was 9 in the family.
my godmother actually said to me, Rosie is the one that I want to get married. And she had one guy one time later on in life, maybe a couple of years later. Rosie was in the room, in her bedroom, and I went to see her, and she was doing something. And then my godmother,
We're good? It says record.
Yep.
Okay.
and then my godmother says, Joe, go home. And I was there maybe 5 or 6 minutes. And I says, why? She says, someone is coming over to see Rosie. And he's coming over, and she wants them together alone in that bedroom. And that's how she got most of the people, I think. I mean, this is my own opinion.
Mm-hmm.
How she got people, she made an actual together and all, maybe at the beginning of a love affair. And that's how she got Augie, who actually didn't care about Mary Colombo. And they used to quarrel like mad. And yet, when Mary died, my mother told Augie, stop going to the grave in the morning. Don't do that. Just keep on living. And Augie paid attention to my mother. He never went to his grave, her grave every morning.
Mm.
The whole thing about Mary Colombo is that at one time she was quite a gal. In other words, she knew many men, from what I know. And Augie's kind of resented that. But then the Duchess was the one that said, that's the one you marry, and Augie followed his mother.
Mm.
And the only other person that did not follow is Josie.
Mm-hmm.
And
This
Josie
is my father.
was, you know, the funny thing about Joe and I, we grew up together.
It was
And
his father.
Yeah.
Yeah. Josie, I called him Josie because that's the way we called each other.
Mm-hmm.
He called me Josie and I called him Josie. That idea of Josie is often associated with Josephine.
Oh, sure.
And I don't know whether your dad ever called Josephine, his wife, Josie. I think he called her Joe.
He called her Joe.
Yeah.
Mosley, yeah. Called her
Yeah.
Joe.
And one of the things that is very evident with Josie was that he and I were together for a long time. We knew each other, but then he started at the farm, at Di Pavolo's farm. See, the whole thing about me and the relation to your mother is that Aunt Jenny's, I knew Aunt Jenny because she used to get me on her lap and tickle me and so on and make me blush. But at the same time, she was out there, I don't know how they were, but they must have come for a weekend. And I said to Josie, I says, you're looking at Josephine. And he says, yeah, she's kind of nice. And he said to me, do you care for her? No, she's my cousin, you know, and I backed away. And Joe had the entire summer, that summer,
How old are you then?
and I would say I was 13 or 14.
So he's a couple years younger than you.
Yeah. Yeah, he was.
So this is, my father meets my mother on De Pavlo's farm. The first time he meets her, he's
He's,
11.
Smitten?
oh, maybe a little more, maybe 12 or something.
Okay.
And,
And he-
the
and-
thing
and
is
he's
that
take-
he
he's-
really
he's-
cared for her.
Yeah.
He took a look at her and he told me, just by looking, he'd say, Joe, get out of here. That's my girl, you know. And I'd say, she's my cousin. And I walked away. Another time, Josie and I were up in the barn. We used to sleep up in the barn at the De Pavlos, all the men.
Yeah.
And they all slept. And one of the things about Josie is that he used to quarrel with Nick.
Oh.
I never realized that the two of them were, you know, not talking to one another. But the one thing about Nick was that he always tried to. He was more going, you know,
Outgoing.
outgoing.
Okay.
And he was the type that would talk to Joe, and occasionally Joe would get angry and walk away. But there was that little difference between Joe and Nick. And I don't know if it developed into anything after that,
Mm-hmm.
because I lost track of. The only one I'd kept track of was Sam, because he played baseball, and he was shortstop for the Simon Pure baseball team, and the Simon Pure baseball team were the champions of the city, and Sam was shortstop, and he used to do brilliant shortstop, and that's when I got to know Sam.
Are we talking in the 30s?
In the 30s, that's the 30s. I was going to high school then, because I was going in high school 32, 33, 34, 35, 36.
What high school did you go to?
Grover, Cleveland.
What high school did Sam go to?
Sam, I think, went to Tech. None of them actually went. I doubt if Josie went to high school.
Oh, I think he did.
I think he went to Hutch.
Hutch Tech.
Yeah.
That's crazy, because I think this is the first time I'm finding this out. I'm not sure if I knew this, but I went to Hutch Tech.
Oh. Oh, were you raised in Buffalo?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I would say he went to Hutch. Nick went to technical high school. I don't think any of them actually graduated from high school.
Mm.
Did you graduate?
Yeah, I graduated. I'm not too sure about Josie.
Okay.
Do you know if he did?
I'm not too sure.
No. That's true, because they were all caught in the Depression.
Yeah.
We were all caught in the Depression. I know.
And they had to work.
Yeah.
Is that what you're
In
saying?
other words, all of us were thinking of going to work somehow. I
Okay.
remember Augie telling me that he was behind a wheelbarrow with a cement, and he had to go up a plank, and he fell off the plank. And Augie and I were two people that really cared for each other. I just used to step in front of Augie, and he'd look at me and he'd say, "Did you see Columbo?" And he imitate Columbo, the detective, and he had me laughing. I went to see him when he was in the hospital with a heart trouble, and he died at Lafayette High. Yeah, it was the Lafayette Hospital. But anyway, Augie was the one fellow that had more laughable things. He loved Mickey Rooney. He made fun of Mickey Rooney and all the rest of the other people. And he was a great imitator. His son finally told him, I want to tap dance. And Augie says, okay, you tap dance. And he gave him the tap dancing.
Uh-huh.
Now,
Anthony.
Was Anthony gay?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Augie never felt that way about gay people.
Mm.
What do you mean that way?
Like Sam was.
Uh-huh. He didn't
No.
shun him.
He did, I think he did more for Anthony, and he actually paid for his tap dancing lessons and for lessons later on. He had all his money. Augie gave more money to his son than he did to his daughter. Remember, I think Carm, she was something. She came up to see me at Cambria.
Marie.
One of the things about Cambria is that a lot of people that were known by us, like Nick and Mary, came out to see us out in Cambria. And Augie never came. Sam came more than once.
Mm-hmm.
You lived in Cambria.
I lived in
We
Cambria.
lived in Cambridge.
Yeah.
We lived there for about 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Joe, one of the things about it that is so evident is that Sam used to come to our little farm, and I had some tomatoes and whatever, but he used to come just to see me. And I was away from Sam. I didn't see him when he did away with
He broke ties with Anthony.
yeah, he did. In other words, Sam became a recluse with his own wife.
Mm.
He became quite religious, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Yes, he did.
Sam was bingo master and scoutmaster at Holy Cross.
Oh.
Yeah.
See, Sam and I got along real good. There was only one time, Sam, I more or less looked at the picture of Anthony on the cupboard. Mary had, his wife, had a little altar-like.
Mm-hmm.
There was a picture of Anthony and his friend, and the picture was taken in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole point about that little thing was that it was like a little altar.
Sure.
She had a candle there.
Mm-hmm.
But my mother always said that she had the face of the La Rosa. In other words, Mary got to, later on, work with Mary Losi, Peter's wife.
Yeah,
She
that's right.
worked.
Yeah, they went. Yeah.
They worked together. So there was two Mary Losis. My son Peter's wife and her. And Mary
By marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Mary Losi by marriage.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Both of them married.
yeah.
Mary Losi.
That's my son Peter's wife. The main
Passed
thing
away now.
about Sam
Mhm.
at this point that I'm talking about is that he came twice, and I brought him up to Shimshak's,
Mm.
way up to the restaurant that you can look over to Toronto, and he came twice, and I tried to say, what about your son? And every time I had that opening remark, because I was interested in Anthony.
Mm-hmm.
To me, he was one of the smartest boys I've ever met.
Mm.
Who would come to me and say, I'm reading war and peace.
Yeah.
You know, kid's an intellect from the word go.
Yes.
And the thing about Sam is that he just shut it off.
Yes.
No matter if you just started to talk about it, he'd turn around and actually would not comment on it.
Yeah.
And my mother even, I think at times, she never told me, but I think my mother tried to interfere in that idea of, my mother never liked the idea of people separating
Yeah. Yeah.
within the family.
Mm.
I mean, the death of Augie's wife left a big import on my mother
Mhm.
because Augie was going to the grave
Yeah.
Mm.
every
Yeah.
morning. And that, my mother interfered. And the one thing about Augie was he was one of the few men of that group that actually laughed more than anybody else. I remember talking to Sam, and he took me to Crystal Beach. And I don't think he ever took any of his brothers. I'm sure of it. Because I've been watching the baseball game with him, and then he'd say, I'm going to pick you up Saturday and we're going to go to the beach. And he'd take me to some beach here at Crystal Beach.
Mm-hmm.
Sam was good to me, and but I could never. In fact, one time he said, I want to borrow one of your books on art. So I says, well, I got a book called The Stones of Florence. And he says, I want to borrow it. So I went to see him a week later, and he says that he gave the book to the priest.
Ah.
I says, did you read it, Sam? He says, no, I gave it to the priest.
Ah.
So I told Mary about it. I says, Mary, I want that book back.
Mm-hmm.
I says, I don't want a priest to have it.
How old are you at this time, Joe?
I was, at that time, 13, 14, or 15, somewhere in there.
Okay.
I'm not too sure of that either.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was high school. And in high school, I don't even recall how old I was
Mm-hmm.
at times.
Mm-hmm.
I know I was for 3 years at Grover Cleveland, and I hated high school
Really?
because my father died. My father lost his business.
What
I
business
lost-
was he in?
My father was a butcher,
Okay,
and
so
he had a
this is
butcher shop, and a very good butcher shop, because there's a lot of people that depended on my father's way of making sausage. He
Uh-huh.
was the only butcher that in that whole neighborhood that used fennel seed.
Uh-huh. I remember my father making sausage and having fennel seed in
That's
the
right.
sausage.
That's right. Josie was, he could have, I always think that Josie, if he would have be involved in the butcher shop, because my Uncle Joe was a butcher, and Uncle Joe had his brother-in-law in the butcher shop, and my father was in the butcher shop. The only person I ever thought would make a good butcher was your dad.
Hmm.
There was no doubt about it. I often thought, Josie, why don't you get... He was involved in something at school, or I never knew quite what he was involved in. The important thing about Josie, and I have to tell you this and skip a lot of years, he called me up from the hospital and he says, Joe, I haven't talked to you for a while. I says, well, it's fine. What's going on? He says, I'm in the hospital and I'm not feeling too good. And he says, I think I've had too much. Something like that, he told me. And I said, Joe, you gotta have courage, you know, a little, come up and think about it. No, he says, it's got the They got my number or something like that. I don't recall the exact thing, but it was that vein, because within a couple of days he died at the hospital, from what I know.
I think I've had too much. I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably the words that he did use, but something like it. I don't recall, because I was very emotional, because he was the first time he talked to me in about 2 or 3 years. See, when he was involved in raising a family, I was involved in going out to the country and making my family. See, in other words, Grace and I decided everybody was against this. The only one that wasn't against this was my mother. She took to Grace, so she became quite good with my wife. But most of the people that got to know Grace over the period of years, Josephine, I think you met Josephine, his mother.
Oh.
Josephine, you remember her. You
My
don't
memory
remember?
has gone a bit.
It probably, she met all anybody that was related. The whole idea of the Lafrenaras is that they were set apart, but not too far apart, because my father used to make contact with Uncle Joe Lafrenara, and they had both, they went to the market together. Joe Lafrenara, Uncle Joe Lafrenara with Aunt Sarah, and Phil and Tony, they both were
Phil Lafrenara.
the two Lafrenaras. Did you know him? Did you ever meet him?
Is Phil Joe's son?
This is Uncle Joe Lafrenara, brother to my grandmother. Joe Lafrenara married Aunt Santa. Aunt Santa had 2 boys, Tony. What's the other
Phil.
one?
Philly.
Philly.
And Aunt
Philly?
Jenny had Tony.
And Mary. They only had 3 kids.
Oh yeah, Mary.
Aunt Mary. And she married a Jewish. Yeah, she married Jewish. But anyway, the whole thing about the Lafrenara family is that you have to go back to Italy when they were, my grandmother was a Lafrenara. And she came here with my mother and Uncle Tony.
Aunt
Uncle
Jenny's
Tony
husband.
and Jenny's husband.
Your grandfather.
They came together at that time. But anyway,
Tony Lafrenara.
yeah, the
Yeah.
Lafrenaras were sort of close to us. I know I was invited to all their weddings. I was invited to more weddings than that, getting
It's-
married.
Probably stood up.
I
Joe,
stood up many a time.
it's always been my belief that the Lafrenaras were from Rocella also.
Yeah,
Is that true?
yes, yeah.
It's interesting because when I was in Sicily and found my cousin Angelina Losi,
That's my father's mother.
Sister. Niece.
Your
but just let me see if sometimes without a chart it gets difficult.
right.
How old is she, Joe?
Angelina is a daughter of one of Anthony, Joe, and Salvatore's brothers who stayed behind in Sicily.
That's
Oh,
right.
okay.
She is Carmen
Yes.
Losi's daughter.
Oh,
Okay?
She never married.
She's married.
Oh.
Her husband's name is Carmen Molina or Molika. So she's Angelina Losi Molika. Okay?
Is she still alive?
She perhaps is still alive. When I met her in Sicily, because here's how I knew that she was still in Sicily. My cousin Richard Losi, who is Johnny Losi and Millie
Rizzuto.
Rizzuto or Tamino?
Tamino Rizzuto.
Tamino, yeah.
No, not Tamino. What was Johnny's wife's
name?
maiden name? Millie.
Millie.
Millie what? She married the insurance Rosito. I think we got it somewhere on your chart.
Yeah,
I think it's
Palumbo,
Tamino.
not Palumbo.
Well, anyways, okay, so Richard and his mother, Millie, they went to Sicily many years before me. And they find Angelina Losi,
Okay.
okay, who is a great, let me not go there for a moment. But she couldn't remember any Lafanaras.
Oh, good. Not?
She could not remember the Lafanara family being
From the
in
village, no?
from being in Rochella.
Jardinus, maybe? No? You wouldn't have
She
known.
remembered the Polaras.
Oh, that's strange.
How about
Okay, so
Alpaca?
Polara is my grandmother, Jenny Borello's mother.
Yeah.
Angelina Polara
The name-
is married to Sebastiano Borello.
Barella is a famous name.
Borello is a famous name?
Yeah, because that's the name of Aunt Jenny.
Yeah.
She was the sister to Frank,
Yes.
and Frank was my sponsor for confirmation.
Ah, Frank Borello was your sponsor.
And I went
Frank is her oldest brother.
and I went to, I asked for Frank, and he came over, and we were confirmed together. He was my sponsor. Then he invited me to Syracuse, and I went to Syracuse, and I lived for 1 week there. I went to see Syracuse University on top of a hill,
Okay.
and
Because the Borellos lived in Syracuse,